Living in a peaceful neighborhood seemed like the perfect retirement plan after 20 years of military service. Little did I know that my dream home would become a battleground with Sarah Mitchell, our power-hungry HOA president, who thought her rulebook was more important than my property rights. When she demanded to inspect my house and threatened to fine me for my American flag display, I knew it was time to show her that a Marine veteran doesn't back down from bullies, even if they come wielding HOA regulations like weapons. I had just moved into the Willow Creek Estates last spring, finally ready to settle down after years of serving my country. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Mature oak trees lining the streets, well-maintained homes, and the kind of quiet that I'd been dreaming about during my deployments. The HOA fees were steep, but my real estate agent assured me it was worth it to maintain property values. Besides, I'd managed to save enough during my service years to afford a comfortable place. The previous owner had let the property slip a bit, but I saw that as an opportunity. I've always believed in taking pride in my space, something the Marine Corps had instilled in me deeply. Within the first few weeks, I started working on the yard, trimming the overgrown bushes, fixing the weathered fence, and setting up a small workshop in the garage where I could work on my woodworking projects, a hobby that helped keep my mind occupied during the transition to civilian life. My pride and joy was the 20-foot flagpole I installed in the front yard. Every morning I'd raise the American flag, a tradition that meant more to me than any HOA regulation could understand. The neighbors seemed friendly enough at first. Mrs. Thompson next door would wave as she walked her golden retriever, and Mr. Chen across the street even brought over some homemade dumplings to welcome me to the neighborhood. But then there was Sarah Mitchell. I first heard about her during my closing, when my realtor mentioned in passing that the HOA president was particular about rules. That was like saying a hurricane is a bit of wind. Sarah had been running the HOA for the past 5 years, and according to the whispers I heard, she'd turned what should have been a simple community organization into her personal fiefdom. I tried to keep a low profile those first few weeks, focusing on settling in and making my home my own. The garage workshop was coming along nicely, and I'd started a small vegetable garden in the backyard. Nothing fancy, just some tomatoes and herbs that reminded me of my grandmother's garden from my childhood. I even helped Mrs. Thompson fix a fence after a storm, earning me some goodwill with the immediate neighbors. The warning signs started small. First, it was a friendly reminder note in my mailbox about proper grass height, even though my lawn was perfectly maintained. Then came the email about approved paint colors when I touched up some weathered trim on my front porch using the exact same color that was already there. But I kept my head down, figuring it wasn't worth making waves in my new community. That all changed one sunny Saturday morning in May. I was in my workshop working on a new bookshelf project when I heard the distinct sound of heels clicking on my driveway. Through the garage window, I could see a woman in her mid-50s, wearing what looked like an outfit straight out of a real estate magazine, complete with a tablet in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. I stepped out of the garage, wiping sawdust from my hands, as she marched up to me with the confidence of someone who was used to getting her way. "Good morning," she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, president of the Willow Creek Estates, Homeowners Association. We've received some concerns about recent modifications to your property." I stood there, trying to process what concerns she could possibly be talking about. My yard was immaculate, my house well-maintained, and everything I'd done was within reasonable standards. But as she continued speaking, it became clear that this wasn't about actual violations, it was about control. "That flagpole, for instance," she said, gesturing to my American flag with her tablet. "It wasn't approved by the Architectural Review Committee, and your workshop setup needs to be inspected for compliance. I'll need to do a full property inspection today." Something in her tone, that mixture of condescension and authority, sparked a familiar feeling in my gut, the same one I'd felt when facing down bullies who thought rank meant they could abuse their power. I straightened my posture, years of military bearing coming back instinctively. "Ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice level but firm, "I appreciate you introducing yourself, but I wasn't notified of any inspection. If you have specific concerns, I'm happy to address them through proper channels." Sarah's expression shifted, a brief flash of surprise crossing her face before settling into a mask of determination. "Mr. Harrison, I don't think you understand. As HOA president, I have the authority to conduct inspections as needed. Now, if you'll just let me—" "No, ma'am," I interrupted politely but firmly. "Unless you have proper documentation and prior notice, you don't have authority to inspect my private property. That's not how this works." Her face flushed red, and I could see the moment she realized this wasn't going to be as simple as she'd expected. "We'll see about that," she snapped, tapping furiously on her tablet. "Expect to hear from the HOA board about this uncooperative attitude." As she turned and clicked her way back down my driveway, I had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. But after 20 years in the Marines, I'd learned a thing or two about standing my ground. If Sarah Mitchell wanted a fight, she was about to learn that some battles aren't worth picking. The next few days were deceptively quiet, but I'd been in enough combat situations to recognize the calm before the storm. Sarah Mitchell wasn't the type to let a challenge to her authority go unanswered, and I was proved right when the first official warning appeared in my mailbox just 3 days after our confrontation. The letter was printed on official HOA letterhead, complete with a color photo of my property attached. It listed various alleged violations, each one more ridiculous than the last. According to Sarah's assessment, my flagpole was an unauthorized vertical structure, my workshop constituted improper use of garage space, and my vegetable garden was non-conforming landscaping. The letter concluded with a threat of daily fines if these violations weren't addressed within 72 hours. I couldn't help but laugh as I read through the list. During my last deployment, I'd coordinated logistics for an entire battalion under enemy fire. Sarah's attempt at intimidation through paperwork seemed almost comical in comparison. Still, I knew better than to underestimate an opponent, no matter how petty their tactics might seem. The neighborhood grapevine was already buzzing with gossip about our confrontation. Mrs. Thompson caught me as I was checking my mail the next morning. "Be careful with Sarah," she warned, glancing nervously around as if the HOA president might materialize at any moment. "Last year, she forced the Hendersons to tear out their children's treehouse, said it violated the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. They ended up moving rather than deal with her anymore." Mr. Chen shared a similar story when he came over to borrow my ladder. "She's gotten worse since her husband left," he confided. "It's like she's trying to control everything she can to make up for what she couldn't control in her personal life. Last month, she tried to fine me for having ethnic decorations visible from the street. They were traditional Chinese New Year lanterns." These stories painted a clear picture of someone who'd let a little bit of power go to their head. In the military, I'd seen it happen before. People who confused authority with leadership, who thought control was the same thing as respect. But what really got under my skin was how Sarah seemed to target the most vulnerable members of our community. I spent that evening reviewing my property deed and the HOA covenant I'd received during closing. As I suspected, many of Sarah's demands had no basis in the actual rules. The flagpole, protected under federal law, the freedom to display the American Flag Act of 2005 specifically prevented HOAs from restricting homeowners' rights to display the American flag. The workshop, nothing in the covenant restricted garage use as long as it wasn't visible from the street. The garden, well, within the landscaping guidelines. But knowledge wasn't enough. I needed documentation. Years in the military had taught me the importance of maintaining a paper trail. I set up a security camera system covering my property, making sure to include the driveway where Sarah had made her unauthorized inspection attempt. I also started keeping a detailed log of every interaction, every letter, and every apparent drive-by inspection I noticed. Sarah's silver Mercedes became a regular sight on my street, cruising slowly, past my house 2 or 3 times a day. Sometimes she'd stop across the street, taking photos with her phone or making notes on her tablet. It was textbook intimidation tactics. But if she thought she could wear me down through surveillance, she clearly didn't understand what patience meant to someone who'd spent months on deployment. The other neighbors started to take notice too. One evening, as I was watering my garden, Randy Jackson from 2 doors down approached me. He was a retired police officer who'd had his own run-ins with Sarah over his classic car restoration hobby. "She's been asking questions about you at the coffee shop," he informed me. "Trying to dig up dirt, I think. Wanted to know if anyone had heard anything suspicious coming from your workshop." I thanked Randy for the heads up, but inside I was seething. It was one thing to harass me directly, but trying to turn neighbors against each other, that crossed a line. It reminded me of the divide and conquer tactics I'd seen used by local warlords in some of the places I'd served. Create suspicion, isolate targets, then exploit the division. The situation came to a head one afternoon when I returned from a VA appointment to find Sarah actually standing in my driveway, peering into my garage windows with a camera. The sheer audacity of it stopped me in my tracks. For a moment I just watched as she photographed my workshop, my gardening tools, even the American flag rippling in the breeze. "Finding anything interesting, Ms. Mitchell?" I called out, my voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of commanding troops. She jumped like she'd been caught with her hand in the cookie jar, but quickly tried to compose herself. "Just documenting ongoing violations," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "Since you refused a proper inspection, the board authorized alternative methods of assessment." "The board authorized you to trespass on private property?" I asked, making sure my security cameras were capturing every moment of this encounter. "Because that's what you're doing right now. And I'm pretty sure the police would be very interested in seeing this footage." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, fear, and finally that same determination I'd seen before. "You don't understand how things work here," she said, straightening her designer blazer. "This isn't the military. You can't just do whatever you want." "You're right about one thing," I replied calmly. "This isn't the military. This is private property and you're trespassing. I suggest you leave now while you still can." She left, but not before giving me a look that promised this wasn't over. As I watched her retreat to her car, I couldn't help but think about all the other neighbors she'd bullied into submission. Someone needed to take a stand, and it looked like that someone was going to be me. That evening, I decided it was time to take a more proactive approach. 20 years in the Marines had taught me that the best defense is often a good offense, and I wasn't about to let Sarah Mitchell wage a one-sided war against me. I called my old buddy Mike Stevens, who'd transitioned from military law to civilian. In practice, after leaving the JAG Corps. "Let me get this straight," Mike said after I explained the situation. "She's demanding inspections without notice, issuing bogus violations, and now she's been caught trespassing on your property?" I could hear him shuffling papers on his end of the line. "And you've got all of this documented?" "Everything," I confirmed. "Security footage, photos, copies of every letter, and a detailed log of each interaction. Just like you taught me back in the day. Document everything, like your career depends on it." Mike chuckled. "Well, at least those endless hours of military paperwork trained you for something useful. Send me everything you've got. I want to review it before she tries anything else." But knowledge wasn't enough. I needed documentation. Years in the military had taught me the importance of maintaining a paper trail. I set up a security camera system covering my property, making sure to include the driveway where Sarah had made her unauthorized inspection attempt. I also started keeping a detailed log of every interaction, every letter, and every apparent drive-by inspection I noticed. Sarah's silver Mercedes became a regular sight on my street, cruising slowly, past my house 2 or 3 times a day. Sometimes she'd stop across the street, taking photos with her phone or making notes on her tablet. It was textbook intimidation tactics. But if she thought she could wear me down through surveillance, she clearly didn't understand what patience meant to someone who'd spent months on deployment. The other neighbors started to take notice too. One evening, as I was watering my garden, Randy Jackson from 2 doors down approached me. He was a retired police officer who'd had his own run-ins with Sarah over his classic car restoration hobby. "She's been asking questions about you at the coffee shop," he informed me. "Trying to dig up dirt, I think. Wanted to know if anyone had heard anything suspicious coming from your workshop." I thanked Randy for the heads up, but inside I was seething. It was one thing to harass me directly, but trying to turn neighbors against each other, that crossed a line. It reminded me of the divide and conquer tactics I'd seen used by local warlords in some of the places I'd served. Create suspicion, isolate targets, then exploit the division. The situation came to a head one afternoon when I returned from a VA appointment to find Sarah actually standing in my driveway, peering into my garage windows with a camera. The sheer audacity of it stopped me in my tracks. For a moment I just watched as she photographed my workshop, my gardening tools, even the American flag rippling in the breeze. "Finding anything interesting, Ms. Mitchell?" I called out, my voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of commanding troops. She jumped like she'd been caught with her hand in the cookie jar, but quickly tried to compose herself. "Just documenting ongoing violations," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "Since you refused a proper inspection, the board authorized alternative methods of assessment." "The board authorized you to trespass on private property?" I asked, making sure my security cameras were capturing every moment of this encounter. "Because that's what you're doing right now. And I'm pretty sure the police would be very interested in seeing this footage." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, anger, fear, and finally that same determination I'd seen before. "You don't understand how things work here," she said, straightening her designer blazer. "This isn't the military. You can't just do whatever you want." "You're right about one thing," I replied calmly. "This isn't the military. This is private property and you're trespassing. I suggest you leave now while you still can." She left, but not before giving me a look that promised this wasn't over. As I watched her retreat to her car, I couldn't help but think about all the other neighbors she'd bullied into submission. Someone needed to take a stand, and it looked like that someone was going to be me. That evening, I decided it was time to take a more proactive approach. 20 years in the Marines had taught me that the best defense is often a good offense, and I wasn't about to let Sarah Mitchell wage a one-sided war against me. I called my old buddy Mike Stevens, who'd transitioned from military law to civilian. In practice, after leaving the JAG Corps. "Let me get this straight," Mike said after I explained the situation. "She's demanding inspections without notice, issuing bogus violations, and now she's been caught trespassing on your property?" I could hear him shuffling papers on his end of the line. "And you've got all of this documented?" "Everything," I confirmed. "Security footage, photos, copies of every letter, and a detailed log of each interaction, just like you taught me back in the day. Document everything, like your career depends on it." Mike chuckled. "Well, at least those endless hours of military paperwork trained you for something useful. Send me everything you've got. I want to review it before she tries anything else." I spent the next hour scanning and emailing documents to Mike. As I worked, I noticed Sarah's Mercedes making another slow pass by my house. This time, she had someone else with her, a man in a suit who was taking notes as they drove by. The escalation was clear. She was bringing in reinforcements. The next morning, I found not one, but 3 violation notices taped to my front door. The first was a repeat of the previous complaints about the flagpole and workshop. The second cited suspicious activity and potential security concerns based on my security cameras. The third was the most absurd. Apparently, my garden vegetables were growing above regulated height restrictions. But Sarah had made a crucial mistake. In her eagerness to assert her authority, she'd put everything in writing. Each notice was signed with her name and official HOA title, providing clear evidence of harassment. More importantly, the notice about the security cameras explicitly admitted that she knew she was being recorded during her trespassing incident. Mike called me back that afternoon. "This is textbook harassment," he said. "But there's something else you should know. I did some digging into your HOA's registration documents. Your property is actually part of a subdivision that was developed separately from the main Willow Creek Estates. According to county records, it was only incorporated into the HOA through a merger agreement 5 years ago. Let me guess, around the same time Sarah became president? Exactly. And here's the interesting part. The merger agreement required all affected homeowners to explicitly opt in to the new HOA structure. I checked your closing documents. That opt-in form, it's not there. This was a game changer. Not only was Sarah harassing me, but she was doing so without any actual authority. I was technically not even part of her HOA. As if on cue, my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was the man in the suit I'd seen in Sarah's car earlier. He introduced himself as James Parker, the HOA's legal counsel. "Mr. Harrison," he began, his tone professionally neutral, "I'm here to discuss the ongoing situations regarding your property compliance. Mrs. Mitchell has expressed concerns about your reluctance to cooperate with HOA regulations." I invited him in, maintaining the calm demeanor I'd perfected through years of high-pressure situations. As we sat in my living room, I noticed him eyeing my military service photos on the wall. "Before we continue," I said, "I'd like to clarify something. Are you aware that my property was part of the Highland Park subdivision before the merger?" Parker's slight hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "That's not relevant to the current situation," he tried to deflect. "Actually, it's entirely relevant. You see, I've just had my lawyer review the merger agreement. Interesting document, especially the part about requiring explicit opt-in from affected homeowners. The change in Parker's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. He glanced down at his notes, then back at me. "Perhaps we should take a step back and review the documentation more thoroughly before proceeding with any enforcement actions." "I agree completely," I replied. "And while you're reviewing those documents, you might want to look into the freedom to display the American Flag Act. I'm sure you're aware that it makes any HOA restriction on flag display unenforceable." Parker left with considerably less confidence than he'd arrived with. Through my security cameras, I watched him have an animated discussion with Sarah, who was waiting in her car at the end of my street. Even from this distance, I could see her gesturing angrily as Parker seemed to be trying to calm her down. That evening, several neighbors stopped by under the pretense of asking about my garden or workshop. Word had spread about Parker's visit, and they were curious about what had happened. I kept the details vague, but made sure they understood one thing: standing up to bullies was always worth the effort. Mrs. Thompson brought over a fresh batch of cookies. "You know," she said, "you're the first person who's really stood up to her. The rest of us, well, we just try to keep our heads down and stay out of trouble." "Sometimes," I replied, thinking back to my military days, "keeping your head down just makes you an easier target." The next few days brought an eerie silence from Sarah's camp. No violation notices, no drive-bys, not even a single passive-aggressive, email. But as any veteran knows, silence in a combat zone usually means the enemy is planning something big. I kept my security cameras running and maintained my daily routine, all while staying alert for whatever Sarah might try next. My instincts proved right when I received an official-looking envelope from the county courthouse. Inside was a notice of a civil complaint filed by the Willow Creek Estates HOA, claiming multiple violations of community standards and seeking an injunction to force compliance. The document was filled with legal jargon, but the message was clear. Sarah was trying to use the courts to force me into submission. I immediately scanned the documents and sent them to Mike. His response came, "Within the hour, she's really stepped in it now. This is exactly what we needed." "How so?" I asked during our follow-up call. "She's opened the door for a countersuit," Mike explained. "By filing this complaint, she's put everything on record, including her lack of actual authority over your property. Plus, we can now introduce the harassment and trespassing evidence in a formal legal setting. This isn't just about defending against her claims anymore. We can go on the offensive." As Mike and I discussed strategy, I noticed increased activity in the neighborhood. Sarah seemed to be going door to door, clipboard in hand, probably trying to gather support for her lawsuit. From my security footage, I could see several neighbors politely but firmly turning her away. The real surprise came when Randy Jackson, the retired police officer, showed up at my door. "I thought you should know," he said, settling into a chair in my workshop. "Sarah just tried to pressure me into signing an affidavit about disruptive activities coming from your property. When I refused, she implied that my own property might need a thorough review for compliance." I offered Randy a cup of coffee while he shared more details. Apparently, Sarah had been making similar rounds to other neighbors, trying to build a case against me by gathering complaints. But her aggressive tactics were backfiring. Instead of intimidating people into compliance, she was pushing them to take sides. "You know what really gets me?" Randy continued, examining one of the wooden boxes I'd been working on. "She's trying to use your military service against you, telling people you're unstable and resistant to authority because of your background." That's when I knew I had to warn you. The revelation that Sarah was trying to weaponize my military service stirred something deep inside me. I'd served my country proudly, seen things and done things that someone like Sarah couldn't begin to understand. To have that service used as a tool against me wasn't just insulting, it was infuriating. That evening I received an unexpected visit from James Parker, the HOA's lawyer. This time he seemed uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. As he stood on my porch, "Mr. Harrison," he began, "I need to be clear that this visit is unofficial. What I'm about to tell you could cost me my position with the HOA, but I can't in good conscience continue without saying something." I invited him in, curious about what could make the HOA's attorney risk his position. Once seated, Parker pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase. "Mrs. Mitchell didn't just file this lawsuit without approval. She's been operating beyond her authority in numerous ways. The HOA board hasn't officially sanctioned many of her actions, including the merger. Enforcement she's trying to use against you." Parker spread several documents across my coffee table. Board meeting minutes, financial records, and correspondence that painted a disturbing picture. Sarah had been systematically overstepping her authority, using HOA funds for personal vendettas and manipulating records to hide her actions. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though I already had a good idea. "Because what she's doing isn't just wrong, it's illegal," Parker replied. "And after looking into your background and seeing how she's trying to distort your military service to serve her purposes, I couldn't stay silent. My father was a Vietnam vet. He taught me that standing up for what's right matters more than keeping your job." I spent the rest of the evening photographing every document Parker had brought, sending copies to Mike. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about stopping someone who'd been abusing their power to bully an entire community. I noticed Sarah's Mercedes parked at the end of my street again. But this time, instead of feeling angry or frustrated, I felt something else: pity. She had no idea that her desperate attempt to assert control had just given me everything. I needed to end her reign of terror over Willow Creek Estates. I pulled out my phone and called Mike one more time. "You're going to want to see what I just got," I told him. "I think it's time we stop playing defense." "Send it all over," Mike replied. "And John, get ready for one hell of a fight. This just went from a simple property dispute to something much bigger." Looking out at Sarah's car, still idling in the darkness, I couldn't help but think about all the battles I'd fought over the years. This one might not involve bullets or bombs, but the principles were the same: standing up for what's right, protecting those who can't protect themselves, and never backing down from a bully. Mike wasted no time putting together our counter-offensive. While Sarah's lawsuit focused on my alleged violations of HOA regulations, our response would expose the entire web of manipulation and abuse of power she'd built over the years. The documents Parker had provided weren't just ammunition. They were a nuclear option. "We're filing a countersuit," Mike explained during our strategy session in his office. "But we're not just defending against her claims. We're going after the root of the problem." He spread out a series of documents across his desk, each one highlighting a different aspect of Sarah's misconduct. "First, we've got the merger agreement issue. Your property was never legally incorporated into the HOA. Then there's the documented harassment, trespassing, and attempts to intimidate witnesses. But the financial records Parker provided, that's where things get really interesting. The records showed a pattern of Sarah using HOA funds for personal expenses, disguising them as community improvements. She'd hired her sister's landscaping company at inflated rates, used HOA funds to pay for business dinners at luxury restaurants, and even charged her personal legal consultations to the association's account. But here's the kicker," Mike continued, pulling out a highlighted document. "Remember those fines she's been threatening everyone with? According to HOA bylaws, fine collections are supposed to go into a community improvement fund. Instead, she's been directing them into a separate account she controls as administrative fees." I studied the financial statements, my military training in logistics making the discrepancies clear as day. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 3 years," Mike replied, "and that's just what we can prove with these records. Parker thinks there's more, but we'd need a full audit to find everything." We spent the next few hours preparing our legal response. Mike's strategy was brilliant. Instead of just defending against Sarah's lawsuit, we'd file a comprehensive countersuit that would force a full investigation into the HOA's operations under her leadership. As I left Mike's office, I found 3 missed calls from Mrs. Thompson. When I called her back, her voice was shaking. "John, you need to know what's happening. Sarah just called an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night. She's trying to push through some new rules about security measures and property inspections. I think she's trying to give herself even more power." I thanked Mrs. Thompson for the warning and immediately called Mike back. He agreed this was likely a desperate move on Sarah's part, trying to strengthen her position before our countersuit hit. "Go to that meeting," Mike advised, "but don't tip our hand yet. Just observe and document everything. We want her to show her true colors in front of as many witnesses as possible." The next evening, I arrived at the community center early. The parking lot was unusually full. Word had spread about the emergency meeting, and it seemed like the entire neighborhood had turned out. Inside, the tension was palpable. Sarah stood at the front of the room, shuffling papers and whispering intensely with 2 board members. I took a seat near the back, next to Randy Jackson. He passed me a copy of the proposed new rules Sarah was trying to implement. Reading through them, I felt my jaw clench. The proposals would give the HOA president unprecedented authority to conduct surprise inspections, impose immediate fines without appeal, and even place liens on properties deemed persistently non-compliant. "She's gone completely power mad," Randy muttered. "These rules would basically make her a dictator." Sarah called the meeting to order, her voice carrying that familiar tone of artificial authority. "As your HOA president, it's my duty to protect our community's standards and property values. Recent events have made it clear that we need stronger measures to ensure compliance." I watched as she launched into a carefully prepared speech about troublesome elements in the community and the need for enhanced enforcement capabilities. Without naming me directly, she made several pointed references to individuals who think they're above the rules and disruptive influences with military backgrounds. The room grew increasingly uncomfortable as Sarah continued. Several neighbors shifted in their seats, exchanging worried glances. When she finally opened the floor for discussion, there was a moment of tense silence. Then Mrs. Chen, normally the quietest person in any gathering, stood up. "Before we vote on these new rules," she said, her voice small but clear, "I'd like to know why we're really here. Is this about protecting our community, or is it about giving you more power to bully people who stand up to you?" Sarah's face flushed red. "I don't appreciate that characterization. Everything I do is for the good of this community. Like when you threatened to fine me for my Chinese New Year decorations," Mrs. Chen continued. "Or when you made the Hendersons tear down their children's treehouse. Or maybe like when you were taking pictures of Mr. Harrison's property without permission." One by one, other neighbors began to speak up, sharing their own stories of Sarah's harassment and intimidation. The dam had broken, and years of pent-up frustration came pouring out. Through it all, I sat quietly, recording everything on my phone as Mike had advised. Sarah tried to regain control of the meeting, repeatedly calling for order, but it was too late. The fear and intimidation that had kept people quiet for so long had evaporated, replaced by a collective anger at how they'd been manipulated and bullied. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, I caught Sarah staring at me from across the room. The look in her eyes wasn't just anger anymore, it was fear. She knew she was losing control, and I had a feeling her next move would be her most desperate yet. After the disastrous HOA meeting, Sarah's behavior became increasingly erratic. The next morning, I woke up to find her Mercedes parked across from my house again. But this time, she wasn't just taking pictures. She was directing a team of workers who were setting up what looked like surveillance cameras on the public street posts, all strategically aimed at my property. I immediately called Mike. "She's escalating," I told him, watching through my window. As Sarah gestured animatedly to the workers, "She's installing cameras to monitor my house." "Document everything," Mike replied. "And John, be careful. This kind of behavior, it's not just harassment anymore. She's showing signs of obsession." I spent the morning photographing the camera installation from my property. Sarah made no attempt to hide what she was doing. If anything, she seemed to want me to see it. Every so often, she'd look directly at my house with a smile that sent chills down my spine. I'd seen that kind of smile before, the look of someone who thought they had the upper hand and was about to spring a trap. Later that afternoon, Randy Jackson stopped by with some disturbing news. "She's hired a private investigator," he informed me, his police experience evident in the detailed observations he shared. "I've seen him following you when you leave the neighborhood. He's driving a black Ford SUV, tinted windows, usually parks, near the community entrance." This explained the unfamiliar vehicle I'd noticed tailing me to the VA hospital earlier that week. "She's really losing it, isn't she?" I asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. "It's worse than that," Randy replied. "She's been going around telling people you're dangerous, says she's got evidence that you're unstable, that your military service left you with issues." She's trying to paint you as a threat to the community." The revelation hit me hard. I'd dealt with my share of PTSD stereotypes since returning home, but having my service weaponized against me by someone like Sarah, it made my blood boil. Still, years of military discipline had taught me to channel anger into strategic thinking. I checked my security camera's footage from the past week, and sure enough, there was the black SUV making regular passes by my house. The PI wasn't particularly subtle about his surveillance, which made me wonder if that was intentional, another attempt at intimidation. That evening, I received an anonymous email from a neighborhood resident. "Thought you should see this." Attached was a recording from a private HOA board meeting where Sarah was presenting her evidence about me. She'd compiled a bizarre dossier, taking normal activities like my morning flag-raising routine and my workshop projects, and twisting them into something sinister. "He's clearly suffering from paranoid tendencies," Sarah's voice declared in the recording. "Just look at all these security cameras he's installed and these late-night activities in his workshop. Who knows what he's really doing in there?" As HOA president, I have a responsibility to protect our community from potentially dangerous elements. I forwarded the email to Mike, who called back immediately. "This is defamation, pure and simple," he said. "She's making false statements about your mental health, trying to create a narrative that you're dangerous. We can add this to our countersuit, but John, be careful. Someone this desperate might try anything." Mike's warning proved prophetic. The next morning, I found my property had been vandalized overnight. My American flag had been torn down, and someone had spray-painted "danger" across my garage door. My security cameras had caught the whole thing, but it wasn't some random vandal. The footage clearly showed Sarah herself in the middle of the night defacing my property. I was reviewing the footage when I heard a commotion outside. Sarah was back, this time with a local news crew in tow. She was giving an impromptu interview right in front of my house, gesturing at the vandalism she herself had caused. "This is exactly what we're concerned about," she was saying to the reporter. "This kind of aggressive behavior has no place in our peaceful community. As HOA president, I've tried to work with the homeowner, but he's been increasingly hostile and uncooperative." I watched through my window, almost admiring the sheer audacity of it. She'd vandalized my property just so she could use it as evidence against me. It was the kind of psychological warfare that would have been almost impressive if it wasn't so disturbing. But Sarah had made a crucial mistake. In her eagerness to create her narrative, she'd forgotten about my security cameras. The footage didn't just show her vandalizing my property. It showed her returning hours later with the news crew, playing the role of concerned HOA president, responding to the very chaos she'd created. I called Mike one more time. "Remember how you said we needed clear evidence of her harassment? Well, I've got something better. We've got her on camera committing actual crimes." "Send me everything," Mike replied. "And John, stay inside for now. Don't engage with the media. Don't confront her. Let her dig herself deeper. We're going to end this, but we're going to do it right." As I watched Sarah continue her performance for the news cameras, I couldn't help but think about all the training I'd received in the Marines about keeping cool under fire. This might not have been the kind of battle I was trained for, but the principles were the same. Maintain discipline, gather intelligence, and wait for the right moment to strike. Mike moved quickly with our evidence. The security footage of Sarah vandalizing my property was just the catalyst we needed to shift this conflict into high gear. While Sarah was still outside giving her theatrical performance to the news crew, Mike was already filing an emergency injunction and reaching out to the police. "We're not just dealing with harassment anymore," Mike explained over the phone. "Breaking and entering, vandalism, filing false police reports. These are criminal acts. Your security footage is going to make one hell of a case." The police arrived within the hour. their presence causing an immediate stir in the neighborhood. Sarah's face, when she saw them pull up, was a study in panic poorly masked by artificial confidence. She immediately tried to take control of the situation, marching up to the officers with her clipboard in hand. "Officers, I'm so glad you're here," she began, but was quickly cut off when they informed her they were responding to evidence of vandalism, with her as the primary suspect. Watched from my window as the color drained from her face. The news crew she'd brought to document her fabricated concerns was still filming, capturing every moment of her unraveling narrative. The reporter's expression had shifted from polite interest to intense curiosity as she realized she might be covering a very different story than the one Sarah had promised. The officers interviewed me in my living room, reviewing the security footage on my laptop. Their professional demeanor cracked slightly when they saw the clear images of Sarah in her distinctive designer suit, spray painting my garage and tearing down the flag. "Mr. Harrison," one officer asked, "how long has this harassment been going on?" I showed them my detailed log of every incident, along with the collection of threatening letters, false violation notices, and documentation of her trespassing. Years of military record-keeping had taught me the value of thorough documentation, and now it was paying off. "She's been targeting other residents too," I explained, sharing some of the stories I'd gathered from neighbors. "Many of them have been too intimidated to speak up, but I think that might change now." As if on cue, neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the police presence and news van. Mrs. Thompson was the first to approach the officers, clutching a folder of her own documentation. Then came the Chens, followed by Randy Jackson. One by one, people who had suffered under Sarah's reign of terror came forward to share their stories. The officers took statements for over 2 hours. Through it all, Sarah stood by her car, her earlier bravado replaced by a look of growing desperation as she watched her carefully constructed power structure crumble around her. The news crew had long since shifted their focus from Sarah's original story to the emerging scandal. The reporter was now interviewing neighbors, each one sharing their own experience of harassment and intimidation. Sarah's attempt to publicly discredit me had backfired spectacularly, turning instead into an exposé of her own misconduct. By late afternoon, the police had enough evidence to act. They approached Sarah, who had been making frantic phone calls from her car. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw her face contort with rage as they informed her she was being charged with vandalism, criminal trespassing, and filing false reports. "You don't understand," she screamed, her voice carrying across the street. "I'm protecting this community. He's the one you should be arresting. He's dangerous." The officers remained professional as they read her rights, but her outburst had only served to reinforce everything we'd been saying about her behavior. Several neighbors were recording the scene on their phones, and I knew this would be the final nail in the coffin of her authority. As Sarah was escorted to the police car, I noticed James Parker, the HOA's lawyer, pulling up to the scene. He quickly approached the officers, identifying himself not as Sarah's counsel, but as a witness willing to provide additional evidence of her misconduct. Mike arrived shortly after, carrying a thick folder of legal documents. "The emergency injunction has been granted," he informed me. "She's legally barred from coming within 500 feet of your property or contacting you in any way." But that's just the beginning. He showed me the additional legal filings he'd prepared. A comprehensive civil suit against both Sarah personally and the HOA, demanding not just damages, but a complete audit of the association's finances under her leadership. "The criminal charges will be handled by the district attorney," Mike explained, "but our civil case is going to ensure she can never hold a position of authority in this or any other HOA again." As the police car carrying Sarah pulled away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The battle wasn't over. We still had court proceedings ahead, but the neighborhood's fear of Sarah Mitchell had been broken. People were already gathering in small groups, talking openly about their experiences and discussing plans for reforming the HOA. Mrs. Thompson touched my arm gently. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for standing up to her, but for giving the rest of us the courage to do the same." I looked at my torn-down flag, still lying on the ground where Sarah had thrown it. In the Marines, we have a saying, "No one left behind." That doesn't just apply to the battlefield. Sometimes the toughest fights are right here at home. The aftermath of Sarah's arrest sent shockwaves through Willow Creek Estates. While she was released on bail the same evening, her world had fundamentally changed. The image she'd carefully crafted as the authoritative HOA president had been shattered, replaced by security camera footage of her vandalizing a veteran's property in the middle of the night. The local news coverage wasn't what she'd hoped for either. Instead of her planned story about a dangerous resident, the headline read, "HOA president arrested, allegations of harassment, vandalism, and financial misconduct." The reporter had done her homework, digging into Sarah's history of complaints and interviewing multiple residents about their experiences under her leadership. Mike called early the next morning with updates. "Sarah's lawyer reached out," he said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "They're trying to do damage control, offering to drop all HOA complaints against you if we'll withdraw our criminal charges." I couldn't help but laugh. They do realize the criminal charges aren't up to us anymore, right? That's what I told them. The DA's office is taking this very seriously, especially given the pattern of harassment and the evidence of financial misconduct. They're expanding their investigation to include potential fraud charges related to the HOA funds. The next few days brought a flurry of activity in the neighborhood. The remaining HOA board members called an emergency session to suspend Sarah from her position, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. James Parker, the HOA lawyer who had helped expose her misconduct, was working with the board to review all of her previous actions and decisions. "It's worse than we thought," Parker told me during a visit to update me on the proceedings. She wasn't just abusing her authority, she was running the HOA like her personal fiefdom. We found evidence of kickbacks from contractors, unauthorized fines that went straight into her pocket, even altered meeting minutes to push through her agenda. The surveillance cameras Sarah had installed to monitor my house were quickly removed, but not before they provided even more evidence against her. The company that installed them revealed that she had paid for them with HOA funds, claiming they were for community security, but had them specifically configured to send footage directly to her personal devices. Perhaps the most significant change was in the neighborhood itself. People who had previously hurried past each other with quick, nervous waves were now stopping to talk, sharing their experiences and discussing how to prevent another Sarah from rising to power. The sense of fear that had hung over the community was lifting, replaced by a determination to rebuild the HOA into what it should have been all along, a tool for community cooperation rather than control. Randy Jackson took the lead in organizing community meetings to discuss HOA reform. "We need to completely overhaul the bylaws," he explained during one session. "Create proper checks and balances, term limits for board members, and clear procedures for addressing grievances." I attended these meetings, but kept a relatively low profile. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about the community finding its voice and taking back control from those who would abuse their power. The criminal investigation continued to uncover more evidence of Sarah's misconduct. The DA's office had obtained warrants to search her home and office, finding years of documents that detailed her systematic abuse of power. The private investigator she'd hired to follow me came forward, revealing that she had used HOA funds to pay for his services and had specifically instructed him to find or manufacture evidence that I was unstable. Mike kept me updated on the legal proceedings. The DA is considering additional charges related to financial fraud, he reported. And our civil case is rock solid. The evidence of her personal vendetta against you, combined with the documented financial misconduct, is going to make it virtually impossible for her to ever hold a position of authority in any HOA again. One morning, about a week after Sarah's arrest, I was raising a new American flag on my restored flagpole when Mrs. Thompson approached with tears in her eyes. "I need to apologize," she said. "When Sarah first started targeting you, I was too afraid to speak up. We all were. We watched her harass you, spread lies about you, even vandalize your property, and we stayed quiet because we were scared of becoming her next target." I understood their fear. Fear was a powerful tool, one that people like Sarah knew how to use effectively. "What matters is that you found your courage," I told her. "Sometimes it takes one person standing up to show others that they can stand up too." The neighborhood began to heal. The garden Sarah had tried to cite me for was now becoming a community project, with neighbors contributing plants and helping with maintenance. My workshop, which she had tried to paint as suspicious, became a gathering place where I taught basic woodworking to interested residents. The very things she had tried to use against me were bringing the community together. As I watched children playing freely in their yards again and neighbors chatting without fear of being reported for imaginary violations, I thought about the different kinds of battles we face in life. Some are fought with weapons and tactics, others with courage and conviction. But the most important victories are often the ones that free people from fear and restore their faith in community. The war wasn't over. We still had court dates ahead and an HOA to rebuild, but the tide had turned. Sarah's reign of terror had ended, and in its wake, something better was beginning to grow. The legal proceedings moved forward with unexpected speed. Sarah's initial court appearance was set for early the following week, and the district attorney's office had built a substantial case. The evidence we'd gathered, from security footage to financial records, painted a clear picture of systematic abuse of power and criminal behavior. I sat in the courtroom with Mike, watching as Sarah appeared before the judge. Gone was the imperious HOA president who had terrorized our neighborhood. In her place was a subdued figure in a conservative suit, her usual confidence replaced by nervous glances at her legal team. The charges were read out: criminal trespassing, vandalism, filing false police reports, and multiple counts of financial fraud. The DA had discovered that Sarah's misuse of HOA funds went far beyond what we'd initially uncovered. She had been running a complex scheme using her position to funnel money through fake contractors and inflated maintenance bills. "Your Honor," Sarah's lawyer began, "my client has been a respected member of the community for years. These charges stem from a simple misunderstanding about HOA regulations and—" The judge cut him off. "Counselor, vandalizing a veteran's property and filing false police reports hardly constitutes a simple misunderstanding, and these financial records suggest something far more systematic." Sarah's lawyer tried to argue for leniency, citing her years of community service. But the prosecution countered with testimony from James Parker, who detailed how she had manipulated HOA records and used intimidation to maintain her power. The security footage of her vandalizing my property was particularly damning. Watching it played in court, several jurors visibly recoiled at the sight of her tearing down an American flag. During a break in the proceedings, Mike pulled me aside. "The DA wants to know if you'd be willing to testify about the harassment campaign. Your military background and detailed documentation make you a particularly credible witness." I agreed without hesitation. When I took the stand, I focused on The facts, the escalating pattern of harassment, the false accusations, the attempts to turn neighbors against each other. I described how she had tried to use my military service against me, painting me as unstable and dangerous. "And how did this affect you?" the prosecutor asked. "Mom, I served 20 years in the Marines," I replied. "I've faced enemy fire and led troops in combat. But watching someone systematically try to destroy the peace and security of an entire neighborhood, that was a different kind of battle entirely." Sarah wouldn't meet my eyes during my testimony, but I could see her hands trembling as she took notes. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The real breakthrough came when several other neighbors testified. Mrs. Thompson described years of living in fear of Sarah's retaliation. Mr. Chen detailed how she had used racial prejudice to justify her harassment of his family. Randy Jackson, with his law enforcement background, provided expert testimony about her surveillance and intimidation tactics. During cross-examination, Sarah's lawyer tried to paint her actions as overzealous but well-intentioned attempts to maintain community standards. But the evidence told a different story. Bank records showed systematic theft of HOA funds. Email chains revealed coordinated campaigns of harassment against residents who questioned her authority. The private investigator she'd hired even testified about her instructions to find or create compromising information about me. The turning point came when Sarah herself took the stand. Under intense questioning, her composed facade began to crack. When the prosecutor presented evidence of her financial fraud, she became defensive and combative. "Everything I did was for the good of the community," she suddenly burst out. "These people needed someone to maintain order, to keep them in line. Without me, it would all fall apart." Her outburst said more than any evidence could about the true nature of her leadership. The judge called a recess, but the damage was done. Sarah's own words had revealed her fundamental belief that she had the right to control and manipulate others. During the lunch break, Mike received a message from Sarah's legal team. They wanted to discuss a plea deal. The DA was willing to listen, but had some non-negotiable terms: full restitution of misappropriated HOA funds, resignation from all community leadership positions, and a restraining order preventing her from holding any HOA position in the future. They're also insisting on a public apology, Mike told me, particularly to you and the other residents she targeted. The DA wants to send a clear message about abuse of power in community organizations. I thought about all the people Sarah had hurt, all the lives she had disrupted with her need for control. An apology wouldn't undo the damage, but it might help the community heal. "What do you think?" Mike asked. "Should we support the plea deal?" I looked around the courthouse hallway, where several of my neighbors were gathered, supporting each other through this difficult process. "Yes," I replied, "not for her sake, but for theirs. They need closure, a chance to move forward without this hanging over them." The plea negotiations continued through the afternoon. Sarah's lawyers worked to minimize her jail time, but the financial penalties and restrictions on future HOA involvement were non-negotiable. By the end of the day, a deal was taking shape that would bring this chapter of our neighborhood's history to a close. Sarah accepted the plea deal the following morning. Standing before the judge, she looked nothing like the imperious HOA president who had terrorized our neighborhood for years. Her designer suit seemed to hang loosely on her frame, and her usual confident posture was replaced by a visible slump. The terms were read out in court. 6 months of house arrest followed by 3 years of probation, full restitution of all. Misappropriated HOA funds totaling over $175,000, permanent prohibition from serving in any HOA leadership position, and restraining orders protecting me and several other residents she had specifically targeted. But it was the public apology that proved most revealing. Sarah stood at the podium, hands trembling slightly as she held her prepared statement. "I want to apologize to the residents of Willow Creek Estates," she began, her voice lacking its usual authoritative tone. "Particularly to Mr. Harrison, whose service to our country I disrespected and whose property I vandalized. My actions were," she paused, struggling with the words, "inexcusable and criminal." As she continued reading her statement, detailing her abuse of power and manipulation of HOA funds, I studied the faces of my neighbors in the courtroom. Some showed anger, others relief, but most displayed a complex mixture of emotions. This woman had held power over their daily lives for years, turning what should have been a peaceful community into an environment of fear and suspicion. After the hearing, Mike pulled me aside. "The DA wants you to know that your documentation was crucial to this case. Without your military-grade record keeping, Sarah might have found a way to wiggle out of this." I nodded, thinking about all those years of military training in maintaining precise logs and records. Sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun, it's a well-organized paper trail. The aftermath of Sarah's plea deal brought rapid changes to Willow Creek Estates. The interim HOA board, led by Randy Jackson, immediately began implementing reforms. The first order of business was a complete audit of the association's finances, revealing the full extent of Sarah's mismanagement and theft. "It's like peeling an onion," Randy told me during one of our community meetings. "Every layer we pull back reveals more corruption. She didn't just steal money, she created an entire system of kickbacks and false contracts." The community's healing process wasn't just administrative. Neighbors who had been isolated by fear began reconnecting. The Chen family hosted a Chinese New Year celebration, something Sarah had previously tried to prevent. Mrs. Thompson organized a community garden club, using my vegetable garden as inspiration. The workshop in my garage became a gathering place, where I taught basic woodworking to interested neighbors. One Saturday morning, about a week after the court proceedings, I was surprised to find James Parker, the former HOA lawyer, at my door. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking uncomfortable. "I knew what Sarah was doing was wrong long before I came forward. I told myself I was just doing my job, following my client's instructions. But watching how you stood up to her, it made me realize that sometimes doing your job means standing up for what's right, not just following orders." I invited him in for coffee, and we talked about the changes in the neighborhood. Parker had been working pro bono to help the new board restructure the HOA, ensuring that no future president could accumulate the kind of unchecked power Sarah had wielded. The most significant change came during the first official HOA meeting after Sarah's conviction. The community voted unanimously to adopt new bylaws that included term limits for board members, transparent financial reporting requirements, and a residents' bill of rights that protected homeowners from harassment and arbitrary enforcement. My property, which Sarah had tried to use as a symbol of defiance against her authority, became instead a symbol of community renewal. The flagpole she had torn down now flew both the American flag and, below it, a new neighborhood flag designed by the community's children. The garden she had cited as a violation became a teaching space where neighbors shared gardening tips and vegetables. During one community gathering, Mrs. Thompson approached me with tears in her eyes. "You know, when you first moved in, Sarah tried to convince us you would be a problem. She said veterans could be unstable and difficult, but you showed us what real leadership looks like. Standing up for what's right, protecting others, bringing people together instead of driving them apart." The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah had tried to use my military background to paint me as a threat, never understanding that the very training and discipline she feared was what enabled me to stand up to her systematic abuse of power. As I watched, children playing freely in their yards again, neighbors chatting without fear of being reported for imaginary violations, and community projects replacing bureaucratic harassment. I thought about the different kinds of service we give to our country. Sometimes it means fighting overseas, and sometimes it means fighting right here at home, standing up to those who would use power to intimidate and control others. Sarah's reign of terror had ended, but its lesson remained. Freedom isn't just something we defend on foreign soil. Sometimes the most important battles for liberty are fought right in our own backyards, one neighborhood at a time. 1 year after Sarah's conviction, Willow Creek Estates had transformed into the kind of community I'd always hoped to find after leaving the service. The changes weren't just in the HOA's structure or policies. They were in the way people carried themselves, the way neighbors interacted, the very atmosphere of the neighborhood. The new HOA board, now led by a rotating committee rather than a single president, had implemented all the reforms we'd fought for. Quarterly financial reports were publicly available, board meetings were live-streamed for transparency, and any proposed rule changes required a community-wide vote. The power that Sarah had hoarded and abused had been distributed back to the residents where it belonged. I was working in my workshop one afternoon when Randy Jackson stopped by with some interesting news. "Remember that private investigator Sarah hired to follow you?" he asked, settling into his usual spot by my workbench. Well, he just pleaded guilty to some related charges. Turns out Sarah had him doing this to other people in different neighborhoods. 2 other neighborhoods. I looked up from the birdhouse I was building for Mrs. Thompson's garden. "Yeah," Randy nodded grimly. She was consulting for other HOAs, trying to set up the same kind of control system she had here. The DA's office is investigating at least 3 other communities where she was involved. The revelation sent a chill down my spine. Sarah's influence had stretched further than any of us had realized. Her attempt to control our neighborhood hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been part of a larger pattern, a systematic approach to gaining power over communities. Later that week, Mike called with an update on the civil case settlements. Sarah's restitution payments were being distributed to the HOA and the residents she'd directly harmed. But more importantly, our case had sparked a broader conversation about HOA reform at the state level. They're using Willow Creek as a case study, Mike explained. The legislature is considering a bill that would require more oversight of HOAs, including regular audits and limits on presidential powers. They're calling it the Community Protection Act, but some of us are calling it the Sarah's Law. The impact of our stand against Sarah continued to ripple outward. I began receiving emails and letters from residents in other communities dealing with similar situations. People facing harassment from power-hungry HOA boards, seeking advice on how to fight back. With Mike's help, I put together a guide on documenting harassment, understanding homeowner rights, and organizing community resistance to HOA abuse. One evening, as I was hosting a workshop session teaching some neighbors basic furniture repair, Mrs. Chen brought up an interesting point. "You know," she said, carefully sanding a table leg, "before all this happened, I used to think standing up to authority meant big, dramatic gestures. But you showed us it's really about small, consistent actions, documenting everything, knowing your rights, building community support." She was right. The military had taught me that victories aren't always won through dramatic confrontations. Sometimes they're won through careful preparation, attention to detail, and the willingness to stand your ground when it matters most. The workshop sessions had become more than just woodworking classes. They were community gatherings where people shared stories, discussed neighborhood issues, and helped each other with projects. The very space Sarah had tried to paint as suspicious had become a symbol of community solidarity. James Parker, who had transitioned from HOA lawyer to community advocate, often joined these sessions. He was working on a book about preventing HOA abuse, using our case as a central example. The key, he told me during one session, is understanding that HOAs aren't inherently bad. They're tools that can be used either to build community or to control it. What happened here at Willow Creek is showing other communities how to ensure it's the former, not the latter. As for Sarah herself, we occasionally heard updates through the grapevine. She had moved to another state after completing her house arrest, but the terms of her plea deal and the civil judgment ensured she could never again hold a position of authority in any HOA. Her attempts to rebuild her life were complicated by the fact that our case had become so well known in property management circles. 1 year to the day after her conviction, we held a community celebration in the park that had once been the site of so many of Sarah's emergency HOA meetings. Children played freely on the playground she had tried to restrict with arbitrary rules. Neighbors shared dishes from their various cultural backgrounds, something Sarah had actively discouraged. The American flag flew proudly alongside flags, representing the diverse heritage of our community members. During the celebration, Randy pulled me aside to share some news. The FBI's white-collar crime unit is looking into Sarah's activities in other states, he said. Apparently, our case opened up a whole network of HOA consultation firms that were essentially teaching HOA boards how to exploit their powers for personal gain. I looked around at the thriving community that had emerged from the ashes of Sarah's regime. Children were playing, neighbors were laughing and sharing food, and people were genuinely enjoying each other's company without fear of being reported for imaginary violations. "You know what the real victory is?" I asked Randy, gesturing to the scene before us. "It's not just that we stopped Sarah, it's that we showed people they don't have to live in fear of their own community. Sometimes the biggest impact we can have is simply showing others that it's possible to stand up and win." Looking back on the events that unfolded at Willow Creek Estates, I realized that standing up to Sarah Mitchell wasn't just about defending my property rights or my dignity as a veteran. It was about protecting the fundamental principles of community and justice that I'd sworn to defend in the Marines. The ripple effects of our victory against HOA abuse had spread far beyond our neighborhood, touching communities across the country and inspiring others to stand up against similar tyranny. The story of Willow Creek's transformation became a case study in community empowerment. Local news stations began producing follow-up stories about our reformed HOA, highlighting how the new democratic structure had fostered a thriving, inclusive community. The contrast between Sarah's reign of terror and the current atmosphere was stark. Where once there had been fear and isolation, now there was cooperation and connection. One morning, I received a call from a national veterans organization. They were putting together a program to help veterans deal with housing discrimination and HOA disputes, and they wanted me to share my experience. "Your story resonates with so many of our members," the organizer explained. "It's not just about HOA abuse. It's about standing up for your rights and protecting your community, the same values that drove us to serve in the first place." The lessons from our battle with Sarah became part of their training materials. My detailed documentation methods, based on military protocols, were adapted into a guidebook for homeowners facing similar situations. The security measures I'd implemented, which Sarah had tried to paint as paranoid, were now being recommended as best practices for protecting oneself against HOA harassment. During one of our community workshops, now a regular event in my garage, James Parker shared some surprising statistics. Since Sarah's case went public, there's been a 300% increase in reported HOA abuse cases nationwide, he explained, while helping a neighbor repair an antique chair. But that's actually good news. It means people are no longer suffering in silence. They're standing up and fighting back. The workshop itself had evolved into something far more significant than I'd ever imagined. What started as simple woodworking sessions had become a community hub where people shared not just tools and techniques, but stories and support. Veterans from neighboring communities began attending, finding in our group the same sense of camaraderie they'd known in service. Mrs. Thompson, who'd become one of our most dedicated workshop participants, summed it up perfectly. This space represents everything Sarah tried to destroy: cooperation, creativity, community. She saw threats where we now see opportunities. She tried to build walls, but we're building bridges. The reforms we'd implemented in Willow Creek were gaining attention from HOA boards across the state. Randy Jackson, now a sought-after speaker on HOA reform, regularly hosted delegations from other communities looking to implement similar changes. The Sarah's Law legislation had passed, establishing new accountability measures for HOAs statewide, and similar bills were being considered in other states. Perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. One afternoon, a young Marine veteran and his family were touring a house for sale in our neighborhood. They'd heard about the Sarah Mitchell case and specifically chosen Willow Creek because of how the community had handled the situation. "When I read about how you stood up to her," he told me, "I knew this was the kind of neighborhood where a veteran could feel at home." The FBI's investigation into Sarah's HOA consultation network had expanded, revealing a disturbing pattern of systematic abuse across multiple states. What we'd experienced in Willow Creek was just one node in a larger web of corruption. The investigation uncovered consultants who specialized in teaching HOA boards how to maximize their power through intimidation, selective enforcement, and financial manipulation. Mike kept me updated on the legal developments. "Your case was the thread that unraveled the whole sweater," he explained during one of our regular catch-up calls. "The evidence you gathered didn't just bring down Sarah, it exposed an entire industry built around exploiting HOA authority for personal gain. The restitution funds from Sarah's case had been put to good use. The community voted to use the money to establish a neighborhood improvement fund, with decisions about spending made through direct resident participation. The first project was a community center built on the site of the old HOA meeting room where Sarah had once held court. The design incorporated elements from all the cultures represented in our neighborhood, including a veterans memorial garden that I helped design. As I watched the community center take shape, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange turns life can take. I'd bought my house hoping for a quiet retirement after years of service, only to find myself drawn into another kind of battle. But just as my military service had been about protecting American values abroad, this fight had been about defending those same values at home. The changes in Willow Creek weren't just administrative or structural. They were deeply personal. Families who had once hurried between their cars and homes, afraid of drawing attention, now lingered to chat with neighbors. Gardens flourished without fear of arbitrary citations. Children played freely, their laughter no longer silenced by threats of violations. During our latest community celebration, I found myself sharing stories with a group of neighbors on my front porch, the same porch where I'd first confronted Sarah. Mrs. Chen's daughter was practicing violin in her front yard, something Sarah had specifically prohibited. The Thompsons' grandchildren were running through sprinklers, their joy unrestrained by any HOA regulations about appropriate lawn activities. Randy joined us, bringing news about the ongoing impact of our case. "You know what's really amazing?" he said, accepting a glass of lemonade. "It's not just HOAs that are changing. People are using our story as a template for standing up to all kinds of institutional bullying. Schools, workplace committees, even some local governments are being challenged by people who've been inspired by what happened here." The sun was setting over Willow Creek Estates, casting long shadows across the lawns and gardens that had once been battlegrounds in Sarah's campaign of control. The American flag on my pole caught the evening light, its colors vivid against the darkening sky. Below it, our community flag fluttered, a symbol of unity designed by residents who had found their voice and their courage. As I looked around at the neighborhood we'd helped create, diverse, supportive, truly democratic, I thought about all the different ways we serve our country and our communities. Sometimes it's on foreign battlefields, sometimes it's in our own backyards. But the principles remain the same: standing up for what's right, protecting the vulnerable, and never backing down in the face of tyranny, no matter what form it takes. The battle against Sarah Mitchell had ended, but its lessons would continue to resonate. In neighborhoods across the country, people were learning that they didn't have to accept abuse of power as inevitable, that with courage, documentation, and community solidarity, they could stand up to the Sarah Mitchells of the world and win. That's the real legacy of what happened at Willow Creek Estates, not just the defeat of one HOA president's reign of terror, but the awakening of a spirit of resistance to injustice that continues to spread, one community at a time. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Willow Creek Estates could have ended with her conviction and our community's transformation, but the ripples continued to spread outward in unexpected ways. 2 years after the original confrontation, I received a letter that would open yet another chapter in this ongoing saga. The letter came from a veteran in California who had faced a situation eerily similar to mine. His HOA president had tried to use his PTSD diagnosis to paint him as dangerous to the community, attempting to force him out of his home through a campaign of harassment and intimidation. He'd found the guide we'd created and used our documentation strategies to fight back. "Your story saved my home," he wrote. "But more than that, it saved my dignity. When they tried to use my service against me, I remembered how you stood your ground. It gave me the strength to do the same." His letter wasn't the only one. My mailbox regularly brought messages from people across the country who had found themselves in similar battles. Some were veterans, others were minorities, elderly residents, or single parents. Anyone who seemed vulnerable to those who would abuse their power. They all shared stories of how our fight against Sarah had given them hope and practical tools to resist. Mike had transitioned from being just my lawyer to becoming a nationally recognized expert on HOA reform. He was now conducting workshops for other attorneys, teaching them how to effectively represent homeowners against abusive associations. "What happened in Willow Creek," he told me during one of his visits, "has become a blueprint for community resistance to institutional bullying." The FBI investigation into Sarah's consultation network had expanded into a multi-state operation. The evidence we'd gathered had helped expose a sophisticated system of HOA manipulation that stretched from coast to coast. Sarah, it turned out, had been just one player in a larger scheme to turn homeowners associations into profit centers through systematic harassment and financial exploitation. Randy Jackson, whose law enforcement background proved invaluable in the investigation, kept me updated on the developments. "They're calling it Operation Community Shield," he explained during one of our regular coffee meetings. The network included property management companies, contractors, and even some local government officials. They had a whole playbook for taking control of communities and squeezing them for profit. The most surprising development came when James Parker, our former HOA lawyer, published his book about the case. The Willow Creek Warning: How One Community Exposed HOA Corruption became an unexpected bestseller, bringing national attention to the issue of HOA abuse. The book detailed not just our fight against Sarah, but the broader implications for community governance and civil rights. Our community center had become a hub for neighborhood organizing, hosting regular workshops on homeowner rights and community advocacy. Veterans groups held meetings there, sharing strategies for dealing with housing discrimination and HOA harassment. Civil rights organizations used it as a case study in community empowerment. Mrs. Thompson, who'd become one of our most active community leaders, started a support group for residents dealing with HOA issues in other neighborhoods. What we learned from fighting Sarah, she explained during one session, is that the biggest weapon these bullies have is isolation. When we come together, share our stories, and support each other, their power starts to crumble. The changes in our community had caught the attention of urban planners and sociologists. Research teams from several universities came to study what they called the Willow Creek model of community governance. They were particularly interested in how our reformed HOA had managed to maintain property values and community standards while protecting individual rights and fostering inclusion. One afternoon, while working in my workshop with a group of veterans on a project for the community center, I received an unexpected call. A producer from a major news network wanted to do a documentary about HOA abuse, using our story as the central narrative. They saw it as a microcosm of larger issues about power, community, and resistance to tyranny. Your stand against Sarah Mitchell, the producer explained, resonates with people because it's about more than just HOA regulations. It's about standing up to abuse of power wherever we find it. It's about ordinary people finding the courage to fight back against systemic bullying. The documentary project brought reporters and cameras to Willow Creek, but what they found wasn't just a story about conflict and resistance. They found a thriving, diverse community that had emerged stronger from its battle with authoritarianism. They filmed children playing freely in yards that had once been subject to arbitrary restrictions, neighbors sharing meals in gardens that had once been cited as violations, and veterans finding peace in a community that honored rather than feared their service. During the filming, we received news about Sarah Mitchell. She had tried to start over in another state, but her past had followed her. When she attempted to join another HOA board under a different name, residents recognized her from the news coverage of our case. The ensuing scandal forced her to move again, a fitting consequence for someone who had tried to force others from their homes. The most meaningful validation came during a visit from a group of military families looking to relocate to our area. They had specifically sought out Willow Creek after hearing about our story. "We've dealt with enough command structures in our military lives," one spouse told me. "We want to live somewhere that understands the difference between true leadership and mere authority." Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that our fight against Sarah Mitchell had never really been about HOA regulations or property rights. It had been about the fundamental American values I'd sworn to defend as a Marine. Freedom from tyranny, the right to live in peace in one's own home, and the power of community to stand against injustice. The workshop in my garage, which Sarah had tried to shut down, now hosted regular gatherings of veterans and community members working on projects for local charities. The garden she had cited as a violation had become a community teaching space where neighbors shared cultural traditions and growing techniques. The flagpole she had torn down flew both the American flag and our community flag proudly, symbols of the liberty we had fought to protect both abroad and at home. As I watched the sun set over Willow Creek Estates one evening, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends and allies, I thought about the strange path that had led us here. None of us had wanted this fight, but in standing up to Sarah Mitchell, we had discovered something powerful about ourselves and our community. We had learned that the principles of democracy and justice don't just exist in grand institutions or on distant battlefields. They live in the daily choices we make to stand up against tyranny, to protect our neighbors, and to build the kind of community we want to live in. The battle against HOA abuse continues in communities across the country, but thanks to what happened at Willow Creek Estates, those fighting it now have a roadmap to victory and the knowledge that they're not alone. Sometimes the most important victories are won not with weapons, but with courage, documentation, and the unwavering belief that together we can stand up to those who would use their power to intimidate and control others. And that's the story of how one power-hungry HOA president learned that trying to bully a veteran was the biggest mistake of her life. If you enjoyed this story of standing up against injustice and want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Your support helps me continue sharing these important stories of people standing up for what's right. Have you ever dealt with an unreasonable HOA? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the most important battles for our rights happen right in our own neighborhoods. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.